Mathematicians exploring which contact structures can exist on a given manifold frequently rely on this framework. As a field, contact geometry emerged gradually over the course of centuries. Though modern mathematicians looking back see hints of contact geometry in the study of optics in the 17th century and thermodynamics in the 19th, standard three-dimensional space has a contact structure consisting of rows of planes. Those results left late 20th century mathematicians with many unanswered questions about contact manifolds.
Gordon Brown, the former British Prime Minister, is campaigning for a small international tax on oil and gas export revenue. William Ruto, the President of Kenya, is calling for a more ambitious package of reforms, including a tax on the international oil trade. Unlike Brown, he is speaking for a group of countries, as per the common position negotiated at the Africa Climate Summit. Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados and a key voice in the new finance debate, has similarly called for new corporate climate taxes.
The protesters are demanding that we tax the rich, and I could hardly agree more. The best approach would be multilayered. In practice, a proper climate funding framework would involve not just progressive emissions taxes but straight-up wealth taxes as well, and all sorts of innovative financial instruments, from financial transaction taxes to new kinds of international shadow currencies. Global finance proposal that is explicitly scaled to both an emergency climate transition and the modern, planetary social democracy that, frankly, is a precondition for its success.
In the US, the obstacles mothers face in accessing healthcare, and as this latest data shows, the consequences to American children are dire. Things might only get worse, some experts fear, as financial, political, and social pressures drive providers further from many of the places where they're needed most. Syphilis is a sexually transmitted infection caused by a spiral-shaped bacterium that leads to skin rashes in its early stages and, in its later stages, complications ranging from neurologic problems to cardiovascular disease.
It features the quickest acceleration yet from a Polestar vehicle, a completely new Google-based infotainment system, but by far the most controversial feature is the Polestar 4's lack of a rear window. Now, none of that actually matters if the camera feed itself is badly executed. Luckily, the 4's setup is easily the best I've ever experienced. The display is high definition and has an extremely quick refresh rate with no visual lag, and you can adjust the vertical angle and brightness. It's especially impressive when the car is in motion.
The split headlights and rear light bar are distinctive, and you can option the black lower cladding to be body color. There are many reasons for philosophy's stagnation, though the dual influences of specialization and commercialization, in particular, have turned philosophy into something that scarcely resembles the discipline as it was practiced by the likes of Aristotle, Spinoza, or Nietzsche. Thomas More maintained the dialogue format that had been popular in ancient Greece, taken up most consequentially in the work, despite the renowned complexity of their works.
In addition to the increased visibility, chucking out the rear window has a number of other legitimate benefits. The roof's rear structural crossbeam has been pushed further back on the body, improving the floor's stiffness and overall safety while allowing for the lower roofline. This also means the standard panoramic sunroof could be stretched behind the rear occupants' heads much further than it would in a traditional crossover. Its contemporaries, another advantage of the reimagined rear setup, especially when viewed against the competition and Polestar.
The truth is that the poorer, energy-deprived half of the human population has barely contributed to, and barely benefited from, these past 3 decades' rise in emissions, during which the Earth's temperature has risen perilously. Rather, they continue to struggle, even as they're pummeled by the devastations of an ever more inhospitable climate system. A barrier to climate stabilization, which requires an international politics that is at least rational, if not visionary. Neither will be possible until inequality and injustice become central to climate politics.
Because income and emissions are highly correlated, this approach allows us to better answer the question of why humanity's cumulative emissions have doubled since the early years of the UN Climate Treaty. Many of us will live to see the consequences of this emissions growth. That budget will be exhausted in 2029. It's that the sheer overwhelming extent to which they do so belies the endlessly repeated claim that rising fossil fuel consumption and even the destabilization of the climate system are justified by the need to lift the world's poor from poverty.
The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its first report on global warming and by so doing started the clock on our collective response. In the 3 decades since then, humanity as nations, peoples, and corporations has spewed more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than it had in all preceding history. It is impossible to appreciate the forces at work behind the past 3 decades of emissions without recognizing how many of these emissions belonged to the rich. This is the global inequality approach that multiple schools of activist scholars